Hi, everybody. Hello. Hi. Good afternoon. Nice to see you all. My name is Adriana Link, and I am the Curator of History of Science here at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to those of you in person as well as online for today's very special program, City of Knowledge, Science, Place, Power, organized in collaboration with the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. We're quite delighted to have you all here today. For those joining for the first time, any first-timers here? Couple, great, welcome. The American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. It is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. We have membership. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts, and humanities in public life. We also promote research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, especially to younger scholars who need that support the most. And our library and museum collections located across the street, as well as our research centers, serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. So as always, please keep an eye on our website, www.amphilsoc.org, to learn more about who we are, what we do, and all of the upcoming programming, especially this year. So today's program reflects the merger of two distinct initiatives exploring the relationship between science and society in the lead up to America's semi-quincentennial this July. I'll leave it to my Smithsonian colleagues to talk more about the City of Knowledge series, but I'll say just a few words about the APS's America's Scientific Revolutionaries project before I hand things off. America's Scientific Revolutionaries has served as the signature program for the Center for the History of Science since its launch in July 2024. Funded by the Richard Lounsbury Foundation, this two-year initiative highlights the contributions of lesser-known scientists and physicians who were active during the Revolutionary era, as well as considers their ongoing legacies and contributions for scientific work today. We've explored these legacies through a number of different deliverables, through educational videos, classroom activities, programs, podcasts, blogs, and more, and we also through our collections. So I have pulled out a few things here that highlight our 6 key figures: Benjamin Rush, David Rittenhouse, the Bartram family, Joseph Priestley, James Madison, and Catherine Haynes. So I encourage you to explore these objects and their stories in the cases after today's program. I likewise want to acknowledge the work of 2 other individuals who have made this project, as well as today's program, possible. So Jeff Applehans, who's here. Jeff, if you want to do a wave, who has been really central to this project's framing and execution since its inception, and Vince Femia, if you want to wave, thank you, who has helped expand it in new directions, including through this collaboration with the Smithsonian. So I'm very excited that you'll have a chance to hear more from both of them today. But for now, I hope you'll please join me in welcoming Wesley Chenault, who is the Associate Director of Strategic Initiatives and Programs from the Smithsonian, to formally introduce today's event. So thank you all.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wesley Chenault, as Adriana just mentioned. I am Associate Director of Strategic Initiatives and Programs with Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. For those joining who may not be familiar with our unit, the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives is an international system of research libraries and an institutional archives with 44,000 cubic feet of archival materials and a comprehensive collection of print and electronic materials covering art and design, history and science. The Library and Archive serves as a resource for the Smithsonian Institution, the global research community, and the public. We have locations in Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, New York City, and the Republic of Panama. So Adriana mentioned a little bit, this is the 4th and final program in the series, City of Knowledge, Science, Power, and Place, and Vince will be joining shortly to say more about this series. But it has been a special treat to collaborate with Adriana and Kathy and others with the American Philosophical Society on this last program. So I want to say thank you to you. I also want to thank colleagues Amy Strickland, our Senior Program Manager, and Vince Femia, who was also Research Associate at the Smithsonian Institution, as well as being a Lounsbury Research Assistant at the American Philosophical Society. For months, they've been working to plan and coordinate to get us to this moment. So I'd also like to thank our speakers who've flown from afar to join us, and also our moderators who will lead us through this program today. Finally, I just want to acknowledge that the City of Knowledge program series received funding from the Smithsonian's Our Shared Future 250, a Smithsonian-wide initiative supported by private philanthropy and created to commemorate the nation's 250th anniversary and advance the Smithsonian's vision for the next 250 years. So thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Real quick, I want to give a special thanks, of course, to Wesley Chenault and Amy Strickland and Smithsonian for all their amazing work putting this panel series together. And I also want to thank Adriana Link, Kathy Person, and the rest of APS for hosting us, helping to organize this event, and for joining the conversation. The City of Knowledge series began as a way to explore DC's scientific history and the Smithsonian's role within that history as part of the Smithsonian's semi-quincentennial programming. We were interested in how science has a shared history with our urban places, and why the place of science matters when we write the history of science. For DC in particular, we wanted to some degree to break down the distinction between local and federal, giving a more integrated look at the relationship between science and capital city. We wanted to do this now because we believe these subjects are extremely important today. Science and the federal government, the fate of the civil service in DC, its people, its politics, its autonomy. We've hosted 3 panels so far in DC at various locations, each focused on a different theme. First was the physical sciences, then we moved to the life and human sciences, and then one that was more focused on DC urban history. We've heard from many amazing scholars on various subjects, from Soviets toasting the launch of Sputnik in DC neighborhoods, to women weather observers at the Smithsonian in the mid-19th century, panda diplomacy at the National Zoo, social science and science education at Howard University, and DC as a region of scientific industry today that has suburbanized in dramatic ways in the last 50 plus years. We're also fortunate to have APS's own Dr. Adriana Link join us for the second panel on the life and human sciences, where she spoke on urgent anthropology at the Smithsonian from the 1960s to the 1980s. But today we pivot to Philadelphia, the first capital city. We are motivated by the same questions and themes, but our attention will be slightly more directed toward the turn of the 19th century. It's impossible to tell this full story, of course, in just an hour, but hopefully the conversation today opens up some new ideas and some new questions for you. I want to quickly, I guess there was going to be potentially some slides, but they're there? Okay, let's see. Okay, so this was some of the, just the view of some of the series panels we did, and then finally I just want to quickly mention the ongoing digital map of the scientific city, which is Philly, this is Philly circa 1800, which is part of the American Scientific Revolutionaries Project, among many other things, which you will hear more about momentarily. It's, I think, going to be a great resource for exploring some of the intellectual geographies of the city around the time of the Revolution. So the last panel we hosted, we ended up centering 2 essential ideas that I think will be useful to state here as well. What City of Knowledge means depends on the time period we are talking about. It's not this sort of flat concept. DC's scientific world during the Cold War looked very different than it did in the post-Civil War era, for example. So the when is really important for our conversation. Second, and this is more of a question, so what is truly unique or distinct about the city in question, and why should that matter? Is DC as the site of the federal government and a city without local democracy for much of its history too idiosyncratic to say something general about the relationship between cities and science in American history? Or in other words, how can these local stories tell us something more about national or even global histories? I think we can kind of bring this spirit of these questions to our discussion of Philadelphia today. So now moving on to our wonderful panel of speakers. Jeffrey R. Appelhans in the middle is the Richard Lounsbury Postdoctoral Fellow at the American Philosophical Society. He specialized in the political and religious culture of early America. He completed his PhD in history at University of Delaware in 2018, and when not contributing to the APS members' bibliography and biography project, he was revising his book manuscript, tentatively titled The Creation of American Catholicism, From the Revolution to the Early Republic. His research has enjoyed the support of the American Philosophical Society, the Cushwa Center at Notre Dame, the New Orleans Center for the Gulf South at Tulane University, a Mellon Fellowship at the Library Company of Philadelphia and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Maryland Historical Society, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Next, Susan Brandt, on the right, is a lecturer in the History Department at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. She received her PhD in history from Temple University and completed a fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania McNeil Center for Early American Studies. Brandt received an APS fellowship in 2011. Her dissertation on women healers was awarded the 2016 Lerner Scott Prize for the best doctoral dissertation in U.S. women's history by the Organization of American Historians. She has published an article in Early American Studies and a chapter in Barbara Oberg as editor of Women in American Revolution, Gender, Politics, and the Domestic World. Brandt's book, Women Healers, Gender, Authority, and Medicine in Early Philadelphia received honorable mention for the first book award granted by the Library Company of Philadelphia. And prior to pursuing a career in history, Brandt worked as a nurse practitioner. And finally, Dominic Vitiello is a professor of city planning and urban studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Historian and urban planner, his research is focused on urban and industrial history, migrant communities, and urban food systems. Dominic's books include Engineering Philadelphia, The Sellers Family and the Industrial Metropolis, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange and the City It Made, and the Sanctuary City, Immigrant, Refugee, and Receiving Communities in Post-Industrial Philadelphia. So this is how it will work real quick. Dr. Appelhans will speak briefly about the ongoing Lounsbury project here at APS. We will then turn our attention more directly, I guess maybe to Philadelphia, and hear from both Professor Brandt and Professor Vitiello. And then I will ask a question or two to the panel before we turn Q&A over to you all. So without further ado, Jeff.
Good afternoon. So America's Scientific Revolutionaries was tasked with a particular, as many institutions were, a particular interest in trying to meet the demands of the 250th Declaration of Independence anniversary. And so what we wanted to do was try to explore the massive archives that are here. Really, this is a tale of lumping and splitting. We approached this really as essentially a born AI project because of the massive amount of information that we were working with. Because we're trying to span this huge period of time from 1764 to 1804 in order to really try to get at all of these members. And the number of these members is pretty large. We ended up with about 804 in that time span. We were aiming to produce content for middle schoolers as well as leading scientists. Some of those talks have appeared in the interstitial slides here. Please sign up and attend. And then we were also trying to connect early American science to the larger revolution itself, right, the larger founding. And so we're trying to pick people to, when we have to all of this massive information, pick people to split to. These are lesser known people within the public mind. Many of you probably know who they are. But we also had some other things. We had a biographical turn that really depended on what the archives were that we had here. What kinds of themes that we really wanted to focus in on. These were themes that are themes in revolutionary history, in the history of science, technology, and medicine. And we were looking for people that were revolutionary in both senses, that were really trying to both contribute to scientific discovery and had a vested interest in the American Revolution itself. And so what we've done is built a large system that compiled all of this information through first Notebook LM, which is a fabulous Google product. You should dump some things into it and play with it yourselves. It allowed us to put things like Patriot Improvers from Whitford Bell in. In fact, we ended up collaborating with all of our, bringing in all of our finding aids within the identified corpus of our history, science, technology, and medicine, the center that we founded. To bring this material together, we had to solve some really unique problems. Some of the things are things that you would think we'd know, like when our people lived and who they were, but sometimes we only know their lifespans. And so we have to engineer ways to use those to find the correct people, because we have members with the same names, like John Smith, right? And through this, then, we ended up with a large number of finding aids, something along the order of maybe 3 to 5 billion components getting touched by all of this information at once. And what we ended up producing then is a large sheet, sorry, this is a little blurred, that kind of gives us some detail about these people. What we wanted to do was try to get a sense of who these people were in a real way, but also who people thought they were. So we used Wikipedia page views as our scoring to try to figure out who people were actually aware of and who they weren't. You can see then that people like John Bartram, pretty well known, and he has a pretty high uniqueness score in terms of scientific stuff. He sort of matched really a lot of our evergreen themes. But so did Thomas Bond, who doesn't have a Wikipedia page, or Thomas Godfrey. And some of these are people that are doing really substantial scientific research that these were lines that we could have followed. This was all material that basically we fed through this system, got sort of other interesting lines of research that we might be able to pursue. But you can even see some of these are people that we didn't profile in our Transit of Venus project component here that you'll see in a second. There's just too many people, right? As we start, all of this lumping is great, but we have to start splitting down. And with that, then, we focused in on these 6 scientific revolutionaries. All of them had, and these are the videos that we prepared for the classroom presentation components of this. And all of these are giving students sort of an insight into a particular biographical moment during this revolutionary period, and trying to kind of tell some different stories. So the story of David Rittenhouse, self-made astronomer, mathematician, clockmaker. He's just a farm boy who learns math, essentially discovers the size of the sun and gives us the distance of the solar system. Joseph Priestley, conducting, as you can see, candle and mouse experiments here, finds out that there's a system that takes place where mint can revive air. The Bartram family, a large, sprawling array of trips into the American Southeast, up here where they collected a variety of indigenous knowledges. Benjamin Rush, as probably all of you know, navigates the Philadelphia 1793 yellow fever pandemic. James Madison, pretty well known to everybody as the father of the Constitution, but you'll see his weather records over here. And then Catherine Haynes had a role in really domestic science was one of the things that came through our evergreen themes that we wanted to make sure we focused in on. And to that end, she provided kind of a unique picture of somebody who was really so difficult to know. We don't have a lot of sources about her. And we wanted to bring this information to students themselves. And so we provided, we're in the process of producing a series of learning activities that are going to be available, or these 2 are on the website already, that walk students through this material in a variety of hopefully compelling and interesting ways, and gives them an opportunity to kind of dig into this in a way that's standards-based, that produces hopefully some new knowledge for themselves, and introduces students to the American Revolution, both scientific and political. That's it. Thank you very much. Sorry, 1 sec. Sorry.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's great to be back in Philadelphia and back at the APS. My topic is Scientific Americans, the circulation of medical knowledge in early Philadelphia. When Washington, D.C. was a mere swamp on the Potomac River, Philadelphia was the premier British North American city for science, medicine, and commerce. By the mid-18th century, Philadelphia was home to the colony's first hospital, medical school, lending library, and philosophical society. And, of course, Benjamin Franklin, the city's quintessential gentleman of science, was the mastermind behind these projects. In 1731, Franklin founded the Library Company of Philadelphia, America's first subscription library. Along with John Bartram, a self-taught but internationally recognized botanist, he founded what would become the American Philosophical Society to promote useful knowledge for the benefit of mankind. Franklin co-founded America's first hospital in 1751 and the College of Philadelphia in 1755. These brick and mortar institutions fostered a spirit of scientific inquiry in Philadelphia. The historian Joyce Chaplin rightly credits Franklin as the first scientific American. He attained international celebrity as immortalized in this Benjamin West painting that reveals a godlike Franklin surrounded by cherubs drawing electricity out of the sky. He was a rock star in his time. But in addition to his work in physics and hydrology, Franklin was interested in health and medicine. He experimented with neurological applications for electricity. He supported smallpox inoculation and advocated for improved urban sanitation. He promoted the health benefits of temperance and nude air bathing. He really did. Franklin enhanced his reputation and expertise by developing intercolonial and transatlantic networks that included prominent scientists like John Bartram, Joseph Priestley, Dr. Cadwallader Colden, John Heckwelder, Peter Collinson, and Carl Linnaeus. However, a focus on these men and their institutions obscures less visible networks of scientific and medical knowledge circulation that undergirded their achievements. Although women such as Bartram's wife Anne and his cousin Elizabeth Coates Pascal participated in these networks, they're relatively invisible in the historical record. And this is not surprising. Most 18th century Enlightenment natural philosophers maintained that reason and logic were white male attributes. They argued that white women and people of color were innately illogical and passionately emotional, and thus unfit for the rational enterprises of medicine and science. And until recently, this discourse has been mirrored in the marginalization of women in these histories. According to the scholar Patricia Farah, women haven't been written out of the history of science, they've never been written in. However, if we flip the traditional narrative and examine the history of science from the bottom up, the lines between science and vernacular knowledge are blurrier, and the story includes numerous women of various ethnicities and classes. European governments and universities sent natural philosophers, what we call scientists, to the Americas to discover commercially valuable medicinal plants. Naturalists like Franklin and Bartram eagerly sought information about therapeutic herbs from diverse women who provided the preponderance of healthcare in early Philadelphia. Women of color had for centuries practiced what some scholars call indigenous science, ways of knowing about the interconnections between living beings and the environment. Indigenous women like Hannah Freeman were recognized experts at healing wounds, fractures, and infections. Black women like Anna Bellamy set bones and cured infected wounds. The art of smallpox inoculation had deep roots in Black people's healing knowledge and practices. Numerous literate white women, exemplified by Bartram's cousin Elizabeth Pascal, also had extensive medical practices and actively engaged with Enlightenment science. These women were not only essential healthcare workers, they were also on the front lines of medical and scientific knowledge production. Elizabeth Pascal was a widowed Philadelphia Quaker merchant and a skilled healer who became an influential node within extensive medical networks that included physicians and scientists like her friend Ben Franklin, as well as indigenous white and Black lay healers. The entries in Pascal's manuscript document the precepts of the new empirical science: observation, documentation, experimentation, and analysis of results. Pascal's self-confidence is reflected in phrases like, "an excellent salve for a burn, my own invention," and "cured when the doctors failed." Pascal consulted medical and scientific books that she checked out from Franklin's Library Company that informed the chemical, physiological, and anatomical bases for her medical treatments. After reading an extensive section on anatomy in Dr. Robert James's Medicinal Dictionary, Pascal transcribed a remedy for a tumor while describing a public anatomical dissection at London's prestigious Royal Society. She highlighted a paragraph that lauded not university-educated physicians, but rather an English woman healer who cured patients' tumors without risky surgery. Pascal positioned herself alongside learned male experts as a legitimate producer of medical knowledge. When she visited the library company, Pascal would have seen displays of scientific instruments and botanical specimens. Literate women participated in naturalists' drive to gather, organize, and classify nature's objects in an attempt to master and control the natural world. Women collected specimens, created botanical drawings, and attended lectures and public demonstrations. Ben Franklin awed audiences with the shocks and jolts of his electrical machines, while others showcased pneumatics with vacuum pumps. Scientists were showmen. This emerging popular science movement made natural philosophy accessible to ordinary people. Pascal was also a member of a women's auxiliary that raised funds for the Pennsylvania Hospital's pharmacy, which fostered her interest in chemistry. Pascal noted, "They keep a barrel of fresh seawater at the Pennsylvania Hospital to cure bilious colic. Drafts of seawater cured John Armit of a severe case." Pascal's description of a violent swelling in the throat, or quinsy, that was raging in her neighborhood documents her participation in John Bartram's networks. Fortunately, Pascal knew an indigenous herb that cured her patients. She wrote, "I made a strong tea of rattlesnake weed and put a vial funnel bottom upwards over the top of the teapot. She advised sufferers to suck the steam strongly down your throat through the funnel and then gargle with the tea." Her precise botanical description of rattlesnake weed, or Hieracium venosum, mirrors that in botanical atlases. She noted, "Cousin John Bartram says rattlesnake weed is good applied as a poultice to dispel swelling on limbs or body." Pascal also cited medical remedies from Bartram's wife, Anne, also a healer. After a remedy for the dropsy, Pascal noted, "Cousin Anne Bartram said this cured the tavern keeper Thomas Worth when his legs were very much swelled, and many others. Dropsy could be caused by heart, kidney, or liver failure." Anne Bartram participated in intercolonial networks that included the botanical experts Martha Logan and Susanna B. from Charleston, and Jane Colden, the daughter of Dr. Cadwallader Colden of New York, who corresponded with Franklin and the Bartrams. Indigenous remedies, like Indian pink root used to treat colonists' debilitating infestations of intestinal worms, were of particular interest. Although their practices are more difficult to recover, indigenous women's medical knowledge circulated in these networks. The Moravian minister and APS member John Heckwelder praised indigenous women's healing skills. He wrote, "There are native physicians of both sexes who take considerable pains to acquire a correct knowledge of the properties and medical virtues of plants, roots, and bark for the benefit of their fellow men. Their science is entirely founded on observation experience and the well-tried effectiveness of remedies. The wives of missionaries, in every instance in which they applied to the female Indian physicians, experienced good results." Heckwelder respectfully calls indigenous women physicians and describes their knowledge as science, but of course they were practicing within their own ways of knowing as they had for centuries. Unfortunately, as Native American botanical remedies were appropriated as standard European pharmaceuticals, physicians and scientists erased their indigenous origins. Almost half the medicines in the 1820 U.S. dispensatory were of indigenous provenance. But in their medical writings, the women in Pascal's networks continue to remember and value Native American remedies. Ben Franklin, his male networks, and his institutions helped to make Philadelphia a city of science. However, women like Elizabeth Pascal, Anne Bartram, Martha Logan, Jane Colden, Hannah Freeman, and Anna Bellamy were critical links in exchanges of scientific information and knowledge that undergirded male naturalist innovations. And just a quick footnote, the APS has created outstanding programs that foster inclusive science. Thank you.
Thanks. So, good afternoon. Great. So I have in some ways a past life as an industrial historian, but I'm engaging that past life today and really delighted to be here. My colleagues have set me up wonderfully. And I'm going to start chronologically where they've focused in the 18th and 17th and 18th centuries, but I'm going to take us mainly through the 19th century and to a great extent to today. I come from you, come to you in many ways, not from so far as Colorado, but from West Philadelphia, where I work for the last 25 years in something called the McNeil Building, which I affectionately like to call the Tylenol Building, right? Because McNeil Labs really made its money off of Tylenol, so that funds, I guess, the office I occupy, or one of them. And I was sitting in this building a couple of months ago when I started this PowerPoint presentation. I was listening to somebody talking about the history of our own university. And I won't identify the author, though I was talking with him yesterday because I'm using him as a straw man in a sense, right? He said something that I think is very well accepted in the ways we think about the economic history and the urban history of not only Philadelphia, but US cities at large. That Philadelphia in the 20th century was perhaps the first US city to replace its industrial economy with a knowledge economy. This is very well accepted and in many ways true in the ways we think about cities and the basis of their economies. And yet, Philadelphia's knowledge economy today is an industrial economy. And Philadelphia's industrial economy, which really built the city that we know and I think most of us probably live in today, right, was always a knowledge economy in ways that, again, my colleagues have already detailed, I think in wonderful ways, all the way up to some of the most recent news about what people are investing in our region's economy today and for the near future. As an industrial historian, I feel it's important to sort of define the ways in which historians think about industry or industrialization, because it's not just the images that people have of factories with smokestacks and railroads and such, that might be in many ways things of the past, but industrial or industrialization to historians means wage labor, or systems, economic systems built on wage labor instead of slavery or indenture. Factory systems of production, which doesn't just mean work in factories, but means more so the large-scale systematic organization of work. It means the mechanization of production, but also transportation, communication, all sorts of things, right? And it means, a basis in mineral energy, right? Used to be coal, oil, gas, maybe. Hopefully we're transitioning away from some of that. But very much, we still live in an industrial economy by this definition, right? And in that sense, this idea of post-industrial doesn't really mean anything all that useful if you were paying close attention to the introduction of me. Yes, I'm guilty of using that term in the title of my last book, but okay, I'm guilty of it too. If you look today, at the major employers in the city and region of Philadelphia, they are all part, of both an industrial and knowledge economy. But I told you I wasn't, I was going to start in the 17th century, and so I'll get to that. This was my dissertation, and in many ways, what the rest of my slides and my remarks draw upon. It's about a family of engineers and industrialists, really following them from the time they came over from England, on a boat with William Penn in the 1680s, up until the 20th century. And in the 17th century and 18th century, they were farmers. And industrialization really came out of agriculture, and the processing of agricultural products in milling, But they were also, from the 1680s, wire weavers, really high-tech technologists, of early America. And that migration of people who had, what we would call today, specialized technical skills is what made Philadelphia, from very early on, an important center of early industrialization. They were also surveyors, astronomers who participated in the transit of Venus observation, helped co-found the American Philosophical Society here. And back in the 18th century, 17th century, even early 19th century, we would have called them mechanics, what we would later come to call engineers. Moving into the sort of later 18th and early 19th century, one of the very most important sort of mechanics in this family, named Nathan Sellers, was, well, he self-effacingly called himself a tinker. We would say a tinkerer, you know. But in his private work, right, as a wire weaver and a miller, he was constantly experimenting, right, and recording his experiments. And some of those books with his notes, right, are in the APS collections. But I want to turn your attention to the institutions in which he and many of the people that have already been discussed, right, were deeply involved, right? Nathan, from the 1780s to 1810s, was a member of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, the Society for the Institution and Support of Sunday Schools, right? Really building, in a sense, and enabling that wage labor economy, partly through basic education, right, as well as abolition. Part of important sort of industrialization promotion institutions, but also part of city government, right, which I think is often left out in our discussions of economic development and scientific knowledge and really the work that enabled cities to grow and become important centers, right, of knowledge production and industrialization. And much of what Nathan was, you know, invested in, right, in the period in which Philadelphia grew rapidly, right, was enabling the city to accommodate, right, that industrialization, and which anywhere, right, was essential, right, if you will. Urbanization and industrialization went together. Nathan's son, Coleman Sellers, the first, married into the Peel family, right, whose museum here in APS space was you know, one of the really important institutions of production and dissemination of that useful knowledge. I hope you see our maps complementing one another here. Nathan and then Coleman's workshop was right there where that line points, around the corner here at 6th and Market Streets, or High Street then. And around them were the workshops, right, the industrial production centers of all sorts of mechanics, right, making all sorts of machines, but really high-tech ones. In many ways, that line points to one of the world's early 19th century, you know, centers of mechanical innovation. Right? They would hang out in each other's shops, experiment with each other's machines, tinker with them, right, and record those. Right. I circled something that maybe you could add to your map too. We have slightly different things on our maps, but I think they complement one another. I circled the U.S. Mint on 7th Street, which was one of the world's foremost centers of metallurgical science, again, around which this community of mechanics gathered and, again, experimented. I also circled in orange, sort of further down on this slide to the right, a set of institutions, right? One of which we are sitting in today. And I like to call this set of institutions, which you know, also Vince really, you know, I think the map he showed beautifully maps, a sort of complex of institutions or ecosystem of institutions that really fostered this knowledge economy of early industrialization. To the ones that you also named, I'd add the US Patent Office, very important for managing and protecting and making valuable and sort of monetizing people's knowledge and innovation. I think you had the rest of them, right? Except for maybe the Pennsylvania Society for Promotion of Public Economy. Oh, by the way, maybe many of us, right? Maybe we all know this image at the left, which has already appeared on the screen. At the left, right, far left, you see the library company, which is now the APS Library. But to its right was the medical school of the College of Philadelphia, today University of Pennsylvania, which, much like today, was fully half or more of the university. And in the 18th century, Penn was a regional institution attracting really the sons of the elite of this region, except for its medical school. Its medical school had a much more international draw, drawing people from all over the Americas and, you know, signaling, you know, Philadelphia's really great importance as a center of medical knowledge, right, which you've already heard, I think, important things about. But the Pennsylvania Society for the Promotion of Public Economy in the early 19th century, and if you can read the small script at the bottom right, that's from one of their reports, right? They asked questions, they did research on, for example, what do the poor allege as the cause of their poverty? What they were doing, and this was another institution in which Sellers family members were quite involved, right, was trying to grapple with and figure out, right, how to deal with, right, both the sources of and how to address the new forms of poverty that came along with rapid urbanization and industrialization, producing what we would today call sort of poverty knowledge. And also the Society for Promotion of Public Economy advocated to bring us what is today the Philadelphia school system, our very first public schools. I'm going to fast forward to the middle of the 19th century and later 19th century to talk about Coleman Sellers' son, Coleman Sellers II, and his second cousin, William Sellers, who were two of the world's most important mechanical engineers and civil engineers of the late 19th century. Circled there is William Sellers and Company, the machine tool factory company that they ran in a neighborhood called Bush Hill, which today we would know as Callow Hill, just north of the Free Library of Philadelphia Central Branch, if you're trying to locate it. That railroad is no longer there. They were surrounded by the Baldwin Locomotive Works, which made 2/3 of the steam locomotives ever made in the entire world, right? They were also surrounded by other very important metal and machine building factories, right, that really made Philadelphia a premier center of machine building in the late 19th and early 20th century. William Sellers and Company made machine tools, right, for other factories to make all sorts of other things. Some of these were massive. They also made, and it's most of what they sold actually, their biggest line of production was shafting. It's the stuff at the top of this image, which transmitted steam power from steam engines to drive every machine in every factory before we had electrical wires bringing power to machines, right? This factory and many others in Bush Hill and around Philadelphia was really used as a laboratory, continuing that tradition of experimentation I described in earlier generations, right? And in very precise ways, trying to perfect the efficiency, but also new ways of working for machines, and indeed new ways of depicting and drawing machines, as seen in these images from that company's drawings. Spin-off inventions, right, included this one, the kinematoscope, an important innovation in making motion pictures, right, from 1861, or patented by Coleman Sellers in 1861. If you want me to give you the YouTube URL, you can go look at, an 1861 image, right? That's very early for motion pictures, right, of Coleman's sons sort of banging on a piece of metal. But William Sellers was best known as the father of mechanical standardization, not just in America, but around the world. Through the Franklin Institute, which he led in the 1860s, he and a whole set of colleagues, machine builders around the Franklin Institute, promoted and ultimately won, if you will, a competition to define what would be the standard for screw threads, one of the most basic mechanical elements worldwide. And in some senses, this speaks to the power, right? The scientific and economic power that people built, right, out of this community of engineers. The second bigger company that William Sellers controlled from the late 1860s through the 1870s was called Midvale Steel in Nicetown, Philadelphia, where really Midvale was one of a couple of steel makers in Pennsylvania that figured out how to make steel really scientifically and reliably through investing deeply in metallurgical chemistry experiments. They also, at Midvale, employed a young Frederick Winslow Taylor, both in cutting steel experiments, which were very important in the history of engineering, but he's better known for his time motion studies that form the basis of what we call scientific management, how we organize work, what they teach in business schools, right? The third big company that William Sellers controlled was outside of Wilmington, Delaware. You may have driven by it if you drive down Interstate 495 and see a name called Edgemore. Edgemore Iron Company really systematized, standardized isn't quite the right word, but systematized the design and construction of iron and steel buildings for hundreds of bridges, not just in the United States. Some of these are bridges you've probably walked across or driven across, maybe even today if you came from Northwest Philadelphia across the Falls Bridge. Not just in Philadelphia, but across the Americas, a lot of business in South America, in Australia, and here are some of the taller buildings that they also, Edgemore designed and built in South America, in Chicago, and these ones, just 150 years ago, right, for the Centennial Exhibition in Fairmount Park. These buildings were built or designed, right, to be able to reuse the structural iron ultimately bought by people who ran and built oil rigs in Northwest Pennsylvania. A somewhat later exhibition in the following decade, right, also organized by the Franklin Institute and its electrical department, which Coleman Sellers helped establish, was not just a place where they promoted products and tried to sell things, right, and disseminate knowledge, but they even held experiments at this and some other exhibitions, right, producing knowledge at the same time. Coleman is also very well known, in addition to motion pictures, for helping to standardize, right, the ways in which we transmit electricity. He was the chief consultant in the landmark Niagara Falls Power Plant project and assembled an international commission of the world's leading electrical engineers, well, to choose Tesla over Edison. And finally, does anybody know where this is? You're not allowed to answer this. No? I assume many of you are from Philadelphia. This is my employer, the University of Pennsylvania, 34th and Spruce Street, just down the block from my office. This was our engineering school and power plant where students got to use the machines. And William and Coleman in the later 19th century deeply shaped the engineering, medical, scientific, as well as social scientific and veterinary medicine education at my university. And so if the late 19th century sort of institutional ecosystem or institutional complex, right, of this powerhouse industrial city and city of knowledge looked a little different from the late 18th and early 19th century, right, a lot of the same patterns of experimentation, knowledge production, collaboration through interlocking networks of firms and institutions really persisted across this long period, and in so many ways helped produce the city that we still live in, right, or that many of us still live in today. So thank you.
Hello. Yeah, so given time, I'm going to do one question, but I think it's an important one. So the spirit of the America's Scientific Revolutionaries project has kind of asked us to think about how science was an essential part of the American founding. And naturally, I think this has led us to questions about Philadelphia as a hotbed for both revolutionary and scientific ideas. So thinking about Philadelphia as a specific place for science, I'm curious to hear you all talk a bit more about your actors, John and Nathan Sellers, Elizabeth Pascal, Catherine Haynes, et cetera, how their stories might demonstrate that sort of inseparable nature of revolutionary politics and science and industry in Philadelphia at the time. Was revolution essentially an essential context for making Philadelphia a city of knowledge?
I'll start. Is this the right sound? Okay. Yeah, I do think that when we, these natural philosophers, can you hear me? Okay, a little closer. I don't want to be like spitting into it. When you look at these natural philosophers and then kind of the women that are in their circuits, This was, we kind of split things out, sort of medicine, science, politics, economy. And for them, when they were looking at the natural world, they were looking at natural laws. When we see in the Declaration of Independence, nature and nature's God, this was part of this world that they were trying to, kind of coming out of Newtonian physics, this orderly world where David Rittenhouse creates these orreries, these models of an orderly solar system. So they're really, when we sort of see Franklin as the scientist and as a politician, it's interesting, a lot of times biographies separate those out, and it's very much of a piece. People are trying to look at the natural world to figure out how should political systems work, how should economic systems work in this, that nature and nature's God has planned. So, and this kind of would have gone down into Elizabeth Pascal, who signed a non-importation agreement. She was very much involved. As a merchant, she was very concerned about revolutionary issues. So I think this was all of a piece. I think we need to see science as just intermingled.
Thank you, that was a great answer. The Scientific Revolutionaries Project itself had a lot of these kinds of aspects of it that I think we could talk about. For example, Catherine Haynes, during the period of time that she's writing in this recipe book, Germantown is occupied. I mean, this is the reason that you can't, there's a quartering act. I mean, there are British soldiers in houses at this time. So the revolution for her is quite real. Joseph Priestley was BFFs with Tom Paine, and ultimately he's a flaming Unitarian. I mean, really one of the standard bearers for Unitarian theology, and he's driven out of England really over religious riots, but it was all sort of tied to his revolutionary politics. And they're, obviously Madison, right? I mean, there are a number of these aspects, but what they're really trying to do, and we heard this, those of you that maybe came to Marcia McNutt's talk the other night here on April 30th, one of the phrases that stuck in my mind was that she'd mentioned this idea that science was really how we solved the zero-sum game. And that was very much something that these people believed in too at that revolutionary moment, that there was a way out of sort of mutual losses, but that there were in fact ways that progress and sort of splitting off and doing sort of this American version of that progress was possible.
So I'll give you a somewhat more material answer, and I'll stay in the 1770s with Nathan Sellers, who, by the way, the Sellers were a Quaker family, and yet some of them were what people call fighting Quakers, who made machines of war. But also Nathan tried to participate in the Continental Army in the battles around Trenton and Princeton, and yet he was called back to Philadelphia to make wire screens. And you may think of wire screens as, yes, what we have in our windows, yes, to keep the bugs out. They were centrally important for milling and sifting flour, but they were also the basis, in some senses, right, or the mechanical basis of the paper economy that we had. Right? And knowledge is written on paper, right? Especially in this period, until recently, right? And so Nathan was called back, because yes, he was a fervent, supporter of the Continental, cause, if you will, and willing to fight. But he was more important to the Continental, Congress as a wire weaver to make the very specialized screens to make not just any old paper, but to make the specialized paper for our very first currency. And so in some of those more material ways, right, some of the actors that I talk about contributed. But again, in all those sort of integrative ways that I think you express most importantly, right?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so let's open up the room for several questions.
You mentioned the Franklin Institute. I always thought it was a museum for kids or knowledge. You brought up amazing what research that they do and created. Are they still doing that now?
Only a tiny bit since the 1930s, mainly in astronomy. And you may even hear that on the radio today. But in so many ways, right, Philadelphia deindustrialized as much in the early 20th century as in the mid and later 20th century. We lost all our industrial jobs, right, since World War II. But before World War II, so many of these institutions deeply invested in contemporary useful knowledge or future-oriented knowledge, right? I don't mean to just tell a narrative of decline, but you know, the American Philosophical Society too, before that, right? And the Franklin Institute in the 1930s, really 33, it becomes a museum, much more than a society for educating workers and for experimentation at the sort of leading edge of technology. And that's repeated across a whole series of institutions that I think is actually a really important part of this city's history for understanding our deindustrialization and how we lost, in some ways, a lot of the edge, right, and the globally leading edge that so much of what we've all discussed, right, reveals in earlier periods.
Thank you for this great program. I was wondering, and I have been for a long time, how long did bloodletting last, and why wasn't it recognized as debilitating to health?
As a nurse practitioner in my first life, I think it tells us just how hidebound the medical field can be. Really since ancient times, Galen, bloodletting was part of this humoral theory of medicine that you had to balance. We talked about, politics and medicine, the constitution, a bodily constitution, balancing these bad humors, letting out the bad humors. It really, it went on in some places into the late 19th century, even when people, began to have different other theories. Physicians began here in Philadelphia might have different theories of disease. We think that especially like in rural areas out west, it was just, they just couldn't let go of it. And I think it was that it was this humoral theory of the body that had to be let go for newer theories of how disease and how the physiology of the body took a while into the 19th century before that changed.
Thank you so much for that. That was amazing. And I'm just wondering, one theme that stands out to me is like this evolution, this professionalization of scientific knowledge, and how it, has become institutionalized and formalized. And so I'm thinking back to those more, perhaps, informal origins of the sciences. And I'm wondering, is there room for that today? And what might that look like?
Okay. I think that's so important about this moment of these, they call them virtuosi, almost like the way we think of pianist or something, these gentlemen of science, virtuosi. There was no professional science. So in some ways, it was a bit more open. Again, the sense that science as show, as people would be demonstrating in the streets, it was sort of accessible to people in this pre-professional world. Experimental science, kind of post-Baconian, was hands-on. It didn't happen necessarily in universities, so it was accessible to to literate women. So I think accessibility, how do we get back from, I think in the history profession, how is history just seems wasted on historians. Sometimes I think science, how do we bring that sense of public science, maybe a little not quite the showman that they were, but how do we bring people, how do we make this an inclusive process? And I think, again, the APS actually has programs that are doing that.
If I can just add one really quick thing, some of the early essays, for example, that the APS published were not at all professional. In fact, one of the very first essays that I think won a prize was about the layout of a farm, sort of the best way to lay out a farm for sort of that factory kind of process. Others, I mean, they were obsessed with silkworms and apiary, bees. It's almost like hobbyist science is actually what's getting published, and so they have a very broad definition of useful knowledge.
Yeah, and I'd just add quickly that I think in recent generations, in recent decades, what we call citizen science, right, has had something of a revival. I don't wish to equate it with, the 18th century, if you will. And universities, right, including our own, University of Pennsylvania, have invested deeply in recent years in trying to, in some senses, recreate, right, those stronger networks and relationships between university-based knowledge production, right, and industry in our technology parks, and whether they're successful or not.
Okay, unfortunately we are out of time, but please join me in thanking our panel. And thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.